What if one moment could challenge everything you believe about justice? A simple meeting in the park leads to a serious clash with unfair judgment, and the ending will leave you speechless. In a sun-drenched riverside park, FBI agent Ethan Cole enjoyed a moment of peace on a worn bench, absorbed in his book. The park, with its lush greenery and the cheerful sounds of children playing, was a refuge from the chaos of city life. But his tranquility was shattered by the watchful eyes of Officer Liam Thatcher, who had spent over 2 decades patrolling this neighborhood. Thatcher's instincts kicked in as he spotted Ethan, a black man sitting calmly alone. A vague report of a suspect fitting Ethan's description nagged at him, planting the seed of suspicion. He muttered to himself, recalling he had never seen this man around before. Feeling the weight of Thatcher's gaze, Ethan looked up and recognized that familiar expression of bias disguised as concern. Despite the unease this scenario typically brought, he maintained his composure, marking his page before meeting the officer's stare. Thatcher, disturbed by Ethan's lack of fear, approached him, an edge of authority in his demeanor. "Good afternoon," Thatcher began, his voice polite yet taut with suspicion. "Afternoon," Ethan replied evenly. "What are you doing here today?" Thatcher pressed, searching for something, anything to justify his unease. "Just enjoying the park," Ethan said with a slight smile. The officer's mind raced for further justification. "Are you local?" "I've been around," Ethan responded, his smile fading slightly. Thatcher's irritation grew. He took a more confrontational stance. "Mind showing me some ID?" This was the moment where tension could spiral out of control. Ethan weighed his options, knowing he was under no obligation to provide identification. Still, he sought to avoid escalating the encounter. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his tone measured and calm. Thatcher bristled at the question, feeling his control slipping. "You will be if you don't cooperate," he snapped, reaching for his holster. Ethan took a breath, maintaining his calm. "I'm just sitting in a park. Is there a law against that?" "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," Thatcher said, though his reasoning felt flimsy even to him as he took a step closer. "What description?" Ethan countered, steady in his resolve. Thatcher hesitated, knowing he had no solid answer but unwilling to back down. "Don't get smart with me. Show me some ID." The air thickened with tension as they locked eyes. Ethan decided to comply for now, slowly retrieving his wallet. Thatcher watched with a hawkish intensity, his body tense as Ethan handed over his identification. As Thatcher read the name, doubt crept into his mind, but pride kept him on course. "Stand up," he ordered, creating distance as Ethan complied. "Turn around," Thatcher commanded, pulling out handcuffs. Frustration bubbled beneath Ethan's calm exterior as he complied, feeling the metal bite into his wrists. He could sense the eyes of bystanders watching, yet he stayed composed, determined not to react in anger. With a mix of internal conflict and pride, Thatcher led Ethan to the patrol car, his mind racing. Ethan, however, was more focused on the implications of this moment. He was well aware of who he was and what this officer would soon discover, but the weariness of repeated encounters weighed heavily on him. Being reduced to just another black man, in the eyes of someone like Officer Thatcher. Inside the patrol car, the engine hummed as Thatcher drove towards the precinct, his grip tight on the wheel. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that perhaps he had made a mistake. In the back seat, Ethan sat quietly, planning his next moves as the city blurred by. "What were you really doing in that park?" Thatcher asked, glancing at Ethan through the rearview mirror. "I told you, I was just reading," Ethan replied calmly. Thatcher scoffed. "A guy like you just sitting around reading? You expect me to believe that?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, the implication of Thatcher's words clear. "A guy like me?" Thatcher faltered, realizing his slip but unwilling to admit it. "You don't look like someone who spends their afternoons reading in the park." The tension in the car swelled as Ethan remained silent, letting the moment stretch. "What does someone like me look like, officer?" he finally asked, his voice steady. Thatcher had no answer, feeling the weight of Ethan's scrutiny. As they pulled into the precinct parking lot, Thatcher parked near the entrance and opened the back door, ushering Ethan out. The cuffs, still biting into his skin. Inside, the precinct buzzed with the usual activity, Officers on phones, reports being filed, but Thatcher felt the pressure mounting as he led Ethan through the hall, ignoring the curious looks from his colleagues. He reached the booking area, signaling for Ethan to stand by the processing desk. Officer Jenkins, a young man behind the desk, looked surprised. "What's this about?" he asked, glancing at Ethan. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Thatcher replied, his tone clipped. "He wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Jenkins recognized Ethan for a fleeting moment, but quickly masked his surprise. "Captain Carter's in her office. You'll need to take him to her." Thatcher felt a rush of anxiety. Captain Elena Carter was known for her strict adherence to protocol. "All right," he said, tension evident in his voice. He turned to Ethan, grip firm on his arm. "Let's go." As they approached Carter's office, Ethan sensed the officer's uncertainty, a crack in Thatcher's facade. After knocking, Thatcher opened the door at her invitation. "Officer Thatcher," she acknowledged, her tone neutral. "What's this about?" Thatcher stepped forward, guiding Ethan into the room. "Caught this guy in the park. He was acting suspicious and wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Captain Carter's gaze shifted to Ethan, and for a moment, recognition flickered in her eyes. "Is that so?" she asked evenly. Thatcher continued, oblivious to the silent exchange. "I brought him in for questioning." "Did you have probable cause to arrest him?" she asked, her tone scrutinizing. Thatcher hesitated, feeling his position weaken. "He wouldn't cooperate," he repeated, but his conviction was fading. "Officer Thatcher, why don't you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Mr. Davis alone," Bennett instructed firmly. Thatcher blinked, taken aback but complied, stepping out of the office and closing the door behind him. With Thatcher gone, Captain Carter's demeanor softened. "Mr. Cole," she said calmly, "I apologize for this misunderstanding." Ethan allowed a small smile. "No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job. I'm aware of who you are," she continued, "but I'd appreciate it if we kept that under wraps for now. I need to handle this situation carefully." "Of course," Ethan replied. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to ensure things are handled properly." "They will be," she assured him. "I'll speak with Officer Thatcher and manage this appropriately. But may I ask, why didn't you just tell him who you are?" Ethan's smile faded. "Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. My identity shouldn't determine whether I'm treated with respect." Carter nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "You're right. It shouldn't matter, but unfortunately, it does to some." The room fell silent, the weight of the situation palpable. Finally, Captain Carter stood up, resolute in her determination to rectify the wrong. "I'll call Officer Thatcher back in. We'll resolve this." Ethan nodded again, observing Captain Carter as she moved toward the door. The confrontation wasn't finished, but he felt confident now that the truth would soon surface, and Officer Thatcher would have to confront the repercussions of his actions. As Captain Carter opened the door, Thatcher stepped back inside, a wary expression on his face. He sensed that something had changed, but couldn't pinpoint what it was. He glanced at Ethan, who stood calmly waiting. "Mr. Cole here is not the individual you were looking for. You will release him immediately." Thatcher blinked, struggling to absorb the words. "What?" "But Captain," Officer Carter interjected, her voice leaving no room for dissent. "I said, release him." Thatcher hesitated, finally reaching for the keys to unlock Ethan's handcuffs. His hand trembled slightly, realization dawning on him. As the cuffs clicked open, Ethan rubbed his wrists and regarded Thatcher with a measured expression. "Thank you, officer," he said, his tone calm but laced with finality. Thatcher swallowed hard, uncertain of how to respond. "You're free to go," he muttered, stepping back. Ethan nodded and turned to Captain Carter. "I'll be in touch, Captain," he said quietly. "There's still much to discuss." Captain Carter nodded in acknowledgement, recognizing the significance of his words. "I look forward to it, Mr. Cole." With that, Ethan exited the office, leaving Thatcher standing there, a sinking feeling in his stomach. The confrontation was over, but the repercussions were just beginning. Thatcher sat at his desk in the precinct, tension coiling within him. He had struggled to concentrate since Captain Carter had released Ethan Cole. Unease gnawed at him, intensified by his lack of understanding regarding what had transpired. He realized he had made a mistake, yet the full impact of it remained elusive. The precinct's silence was both a comfort and an unsettling presence, a space for his thoughts to spiral. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approaching his desk jolted him from his reverie. He looked up to see Captain Carter striding toward him, her expression serious. "Officer Thatcher, my office, now," Captain Carter stated, her tone leaving no room for debate. Thatcher stood up immediately, trying to suppress the rising anxiety. He followed her into the office, each step heavy with dread. Once inside, Captain Carter closed the door behind him and gestured for him to sit. He hesitated momentarily before taking a seat, feeling the palpable tension in the room, the unspoken gravity of what was about to unfold. Captain Carter positioned herself behind her desk, took a deep breath, and then sat across from him, her sharp gaze fixed on him. "Officer Thatcher," she began, her tone measured but firm, "do you have any idea who Ethan Cole is?" Thatcher shook his head, confusion deepening. "No, Captain. Just some guy in the park." Captain Carter leaned forward, her gaze unyielding. "Ethan Cole isn't just some guy in the park. He's a special agent, one of their top agents, in fact." The words struck Thatcher like a physical blow, shock widening his eyes. "An FBI agent?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "That's correct," Carter affirmed, her tone resolute. "And more importantly, he's highly respected within the Bureau. His arrest will have serious repercussions, not just for you but for this entire precinct." Thatcher's mind raced, grappling with the implications of his actions. He had arrested an innocent man, a federal agent no less, based solely on his own biased assumptions. The weight of his mistake settled heavily upon him, bringing forth a cold dread. "I didn't know, Captain," Thatcher stammered, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the issue, Thatcher," Carter replied, her tone still stern. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. Your actions stemmed from assumptions and biases, not any concrete evidence. You can't arrest someone merely because they don't look like they belong in a park." Thatcher wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words eluded him. Deep down, he understood Captain Carter's point. He had allowed his biases to dictate his actions, and now he was facing the fallout. "What happens now?" Thatcher asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Captain Carter sighed, leaning back in her chair. "For now, you're being placed on temporary leave while we investigate this incident. I've already spoken to the higher-ups, and they're not pleased, to say the least. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you could face disciplinary action, including termination." Thatcher's heart sank. Termination. The word loomed over him like a death sentence. He had been a cop for over 2 decades, and the thought of losing his badge was almost unbearable. But deep down, he recognized that he had no one to blame but himself. "I understand, Captain," Thatcher finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "I know this isn't easy to hear, Thatcher, but you need to grasp that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the people you serve. We can't afford to have officers who let their biases dictate their decisions." Thatcher nodded, though his mind was still spinning. The reality of his situation began to settle in, accompanied by a wave of regret. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and protected the community. But now, all of that was jeopardized due to one careless, prejudiced decision. Captain Carter stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "You're dismissed, Officer Thatcher. I'll notify you when the review is scheduled." Thatcher stood as well, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. "Thank you, Captain," he mumbled, before turning to leave the office. As he exited the precinct, the familiar sights and sounds that once brought him comfort felt distant, almost alien. He walked to his car in a daze, the reality of his situation weighing on him like a heavy fog. He had been a cop for so long that he didn't know who he was without the badge. The thought of losing it, of being labeled a failure, terrified him. But beneath that fear, an unfamiliar sense of doubt emerged. For the first time, Thatcher was forced to confront the notion that perhaps he wasn't the upstanding officer he had always considered himself to be, that maybe he had allowed his biases and prejudices to guide his actions more than he was willing to admit. As he drove home, the city streets blurred past him. Thatcher couldn't shake the image of Ethan Cole's calm, unwavering gaze. It was a look that had unsettled him from the start, and now he understood why. Ethan had seen right through him, aware of what was happening even before Thatcher did. When Thatcher finally arrived home, he sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel as the day's events replayed in his mind. Each repetition made the weight of his actions feel heavier. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew his life had just changed irrevocably. With a heavy sigh, Thatcher exited the car and walked into his house. The silence of the empty rooms pressed in on him. He sank into a chair, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, regret, and uncertainty. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do next. Liam Thatcher stood in the hallway outside the conference room, his heart racing in his chest. The precinct felt quieter than usual, the atmosphere thick with anticipation for what was about to unfold. The official review was about to commence, and Thatcher knew that every word he spoke in the next hour could determine the future of his career. He glanced at his reflection in the window across from him. The man staring back looked older, more worn than he had just days before. There was a stiffness in his posture, and a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there previously. He straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and forced himself to focus. This was his chance to explain, to justify his actions, even if deep down he wasn't sure how to do that anymore. The door to the conference room swung open, and Captain Carter appeared, her expression unreadable. "We're ready for you, Officer Thatcher," she said, her voice steady. Thatcher nodded, swallowing hard as he followed her into the room. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The long table was lined with stern-faced officials, representatives from internal affairs, a couple of high-ranking officers, and at the far end, a man in a suit whom Thatcher instantly recognized as Ethan Cole. Ethan's presence felt like a punch to the gut. Thatcher had hoped he wouldn't be there, that he wouldn't have to face him again. But there he sat, calm and composed, his eyes fixed on Thatcher as if studying him. That same calmness and quiet authority made Thatcher feel small. Captain Carter took her seat at the head of the table, motioning for Thatcher to sit across from her. He did so, trying to ignore the way his palms were clammy. The room was silent, the weight of judgment heavy in the air. "Officer Thatcher," Carter began, her tone formal, "this review is to assess the appropriateness of your actions during the incident involving Mr. Ethan Cole in the park. We will be hearing from several witnesses, and Mr. Cole himself will provide his account of what transpired." Thatcher shifted uncomfortably in his seat, anxiety building as he met Ethan's steady gaze. He could see the frustration in Ethan's expression, the hurt from being wrongfully accused and arrested. "Officer Thatcher, would you like to begin by explaining your actions?" Carter prompted, her eyes fixed on him. Thatcher took a deep breath, knowing he needed to tread carefully. "Captain, I acted based on what I perceived to be suspicious behavior. I thought I was doing my duty. It wasn't a matter of profiling, I just thought I was keeping the community safe." Carter's expression hardened. "What specific behaviors did you observe that led you to that conclusion?" Thatcher hesitated, recalling the moment. He was just sitting on a bench, looking out of place. "Out of place?" Carter echoed, her voice sharp. "What does that even mean, officer? Did you know what he was doing there?" "No, but exactly. You assumed his presence was suspicious based solely on your biases." She turned to the assembled officials, gesturing to Ethan. "This is a prime example of the issues we're facing. He's an FBI agent, here on official business, and yet he was subjected to your unwarranted actions." Ethan leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Thatcher, I understand you were trying to do your job, but your actions reflect a deeper issue, one of judgment. You didn't see me as a person, you saw me as a stereotype." Thatcher felt the heat rising in his face. I never intended to harm anyone," he stammered, trying to defend himself. "Intent doesn't erase the consequences," Ethan replied, his tone measured. "Your choices put not only me at risk but also undermine the trust our community has in law enforcement." Carter nodded in agreement. "Officer Thatcher, you must recognize that your decisions have ramifications beyond this room. This is about accountability and the responsibility we hold as officers." As Thatcher listened, a sense of dread washed over him. He realized he couldn't continue to shift blame. "I see that now, Captain. I was wrong. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Carter's expression softened slightly. Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step, Officer Thatcher. However, it doesn't absolve you of responsibility. The room remained silent, the weight of his admission hanging in the air. Thatcher felt a mixture of shame and fear, but he knew he needed to confront the truth. "Thank you for sharing your experience, Mr. Cole," Carter said, turning to Ethan. "Your perspective is invaluable, and I hope it resonates with Officer Thatcher and the rest of us." As the meeting continued, Thatcher listened closely, fully aware of the road ahead. He knew he had a long way to go, but he also understood that confronting his biases was essential to reclaiming his integrity as an officer. Finally, as the meeting came to a close, Carter looked at Thatcher with a serious expression. "We will review all testimonies and evidence before making our final decision. Remember, Officer Thatcher, this isn't just about you, it's about restoring trust in our department." Thatcher nodded, feeling the gravity of her words. As he exited the room, he knew he had to work to rebuild not only his reputation, but also his understanding of what it truly meant to serve and protect. Thatcher listened, his heart heavy. He recognized Ethan was right, but accepting that truth was difficult. He had devoted his entire career to believing he was acting justly, yet now he faced the reality that his actions had caused harm, blinded by his biases. Ethan continued, his voice steady. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's career, but I want to ensure that next time an officer encounters someone like me, they think twice before jumping to conclusions. This is a chance for change, and I hope this precinct will take it seriously." Captain Carter nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. Your words are noted." Ethan resumed his seat, his gaze still fixed on Thatcher. There was no malice in his eyes, just a firm resolve that communicated he wouldn't tolerate further injustice. Captain Carter addressed Thatcher, her tone softer yet authoritative. "Officer Thatcher, you'll remain on temporary leave while we continue this review. I suggest you use this time to reflect on what's been said here today. We'll reconvene in a few days to discuss the next steps." Thatcher nodded numbly, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "Yes, Captain," he replied quietly. The meeting was adjourned, and as the officials filed out of the room, Thatcher stayed seated, his mind racing. He had come to this review hoping to defend himself, to justify his actions, but now all he could think about was how wrong he had been. The realization hit him like a cold truth he couldn't escape. As the last of the officials exited, Thatcher rose slowly, his movements heavy with the burden of his thoughts. He glanced at Ethan one final time, their eyes met for a moment. There was no animosity in Ethan's gaze, just quiet determination, a resolve to see justice done. Thatcher looked away, unable to hold Ethan's gaze any longer. He knew he had much to ponder and come to terms with, and as he exited the conference room, the weight of his actions and their consequences loomed over him like a dark cloud. Captain Elena Carter sat in her office, staring at the stack of reports on her desk. Each sheet represented a piece of the truth she was trying to uncover, the internal investigation into Thatcher. Thatcher's conduct was in progress, and it was her duty to ensure every detail was examined thoroughly. She rubbed her temples, feeling the tension in her shoulders. The precinct had always taken pride in upholding high standards, but this incident had shaken that foundation. Whatever the outcome, Carter understood the investigation would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Thatcher but for the entire department. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the first report, the initial witness statements from the park. She had already read them several times, but each reading added weight to the mounting evidence against Thatcher. The witnesses, park-goers present during the arrest, described the event with stark clarity. Their accounts were consistent. Thatcher had approached Ethan Cole with the assumption he was a criminal, without hesitation, and without attempting to de-escalate. Carter turned to the report on the body cam footage. She had watched it multiple times, each viewing more uncomfortable than the last. The footage was clear and unambiguous. Thatcher's voice, his tone, and his body language reflected the assumptions he had made from the moment he saw Ethan. The aggression in his approach and his disregard for Ethan's attempts to explain were all laid bare for anyone to see. A knock at the door interrupted Carter's thoughts. She looked up to see Owen Ridley, her second-in-command for the investigation, standing in the doorway. "I've got the last of the witness interviews," Ridley said, holding up a file. "I've also scheduled Ethan Cole for later this afternoon." Thanks, Ridley, Carter replied, taking the file. How's it looking? Ridley sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Not good, Captain. Most witnesses are clear about what they saw, and from what I can tell, the body cam footage backs them up. Carter nodded grimly. I was afraid of that. Are we bringing Thatcher in for another round of questions? Yeah, Carter said, leaning back in her chair. Let's see if he's ready to talk more openly about what happened. Ridley nodded and left the office, leaving Carter alone with the file. She flipped it open and began reading the new witness statements. They aligned with the others. Thatcher had acted aggressively from the start, and it was evident that Ethan had tried to defuse the situation, but Thatcher hadn't listened. As Carter finished reading, she felt a deep sense of unease. She had known Thatcher for years. He had always been a reliable officer, but this incident had revealed a side of him she had never seen before. Hours passed slowly as Carter continued reviewing the evidence. Finally, there was another knock at her door, and Ridley entered, followed by Thatcher. Come in, Thatchers, Carter said, keeping her voice neutral. Thatcher looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. He sat down across from Carter, glancing nervously at Ridley, who took a seat beside him. We're going to go over the events of that day again, Carter said, leaning slightly forward. I need you to be completely honest with us, Thatcher. This is your chance to explain your side of the story. Thatcher nodded, but his expression was tight. I understand, Captain. Carter glanced at Ridley, who initiated the questioning. Thatcher, walk us through what was going through your mind when you first saw Ethan Cole in the park. Thatcher hesitated, his eyes shifting as he searched for the right words. I saw a man who fit the description of the suspect we were looking for. It was a high-pressure situation and I had to make a quick decision. And what made you so sure he was the suspect? Ridley pressed. He matched the description, Thatcher repeated, his voice growing more defensive. We were looking for a black male around his height and build. He was acting suspiciously, like he was trying to hide something. Carter could hear the strain in Thatcher's voice, the way he was grasping for justifications. Thatcher, the witness statements and the body cam footage tell a different story. They show that Ethan Cole was cooperative and tried to explain who he was, but you didn't listen. Thatcher shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was trying to throw me off by buying time. I was just following my training, Captain. Your training? Carter repeated, her tone sharp. Thatcher, your training doesn't excuse racial profiling. It doesn't justify the fact that you escalated a situation that didn't need to be escalated. Thatcher opened his mouth to respond, but Carter raised a hand to stop him. Look, Thatcher, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to find out the truth. The evidence we've gathered so far isn't in your favor. It shows that you made assumptions based on race, and those assumptions led to an unjust arrest. There was a long silence as Thatcher processed Carter's words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just trying to do my job. Carter sighed. I know, Thatcher. But intent doesn't change the impact of your actions. This isn't just about you. It's about what your actions represent and how they affect the people we're supposed to protect. Before Thatcher could respond, there was another knock at the door. Ridley stood and opened it, revealing Ethan Cole, who entered with a calm, composed demeanor. Mr. Cole, thank you for coming in, Carter said, standing to shake Ethan's hand. Ethan nodded, his expression neutral. Of course. Carter gestured for Ethan to take a seat, then turned back to Thatcher. Thatcher, we're going to hear from Mr. Cole now. I want you to listen carefully. Thatcher nodded but couldn't meet Ethan's eyes. Carter signaled for Ridley to begin. Mr. Cole, can you describe your encounter with Officer Thatcher from your perspective? Ethan's voice was steady. I was at the park enjoying my day off when Officer Thatcher approached me. He was aggressive from the start, demanding to see my ID and questioning me like I was already guilty of something. I tried to explain that I was an FBI agent and that there must have been a mistake, but he didn't listen. He cuffed me, pushed me to the ground, and treated me like a criminal. Thatcher flinched at Ethan's words but remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table. Ridley continued, Did you feel that Officer Thatcher's actions were influenced by your race? Ethan didn't hesitate. Absolutely. I could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at me, the assumptions he made before I even had a chance to speak. I've dealt with this kind of thing before, but it's different when it comes from someone who's supposed to protect and serve. Carter observed the impact of Ethan's words on Thatcher, how his shoulders slumped slightly, how he seemed to shrink into himself, but still, Thatcher said nothing. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," Carter said. "I appreciate your honesty." Ethan nodded, then stood to leave. As he reached the door, he paused and turned back to Thatcher. "I don't hold any personal grudges, Officer Thatcher, but I hope you can take this as an opportunity to learn, to understand the impact of your actions. It's not just about what you intended. It's about how those intentions play out in the real world." With that, he walked out, leaving a silence in the room. Carter turned to Thatcher, who was staring blankly at the table. "You need to understand this, Thatcher. This isn't just about you losing your job. It's about the culture of policing and how we can change it for the better. The world is watching us, and we have to be better." Thatcher looked up, finally meeting her gaze. "I know, Captain. I know I messed up." Carter's expression softened slightly. "It's a hard truth to face, but facing it is the first step towards making amends." With that, she dismissed him. Thatcher left the office, the weight of his actions heavy on his shoulders. As he walked down the corridor, he felt a mixture of shame and determination. He wanted to change, to do better, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but he hoped, somehow, it would lead to redemption. As Thatcher walked down the corridor, the conversations from the meeting replayed in his mind, each word echoing the weight of his actions. He reached the exit and paused, looking out at the precinct's parking lot. The sun was shining brightly, but the light felt cold against his skin. He thought about Ethan Cole, his calm demeanor, the strength in his words. It was clear that this man had faced injustice and had still chosen to confront it head-on, to advocate for change rather than seek revenge. Thatcher sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heart raced, a mix of anger, regret, and a newfound sense of responsibility swirling within him. He had always prided himself on his dedication to the job, but now he had to confront the possibility that he had been part of the very system he believed he was serving. The thought made him feel sick. As he drove away from the precinct, Thatcher couldn't shake the feeling that he was at a crossroads. He had the option to bury his head in the sand, to ignore the implications of what he had done, and hope that time would make it all fade. Or he could confront the reality of his mistakes and strive to become better. The choice was daunting, but deep down, he knew there was no escaping it. Days passed, and the investigation continued. Thatcher found himself reflecting on everything he had learned, both from the evidence and from his conversations with Ethan. He began to research bias in policing, reading articles and studies that explored the very issues he had once been blind to. Each page he turned felt like a revelation, a layer of his ignorance peeling away. He sought out workshops on de-escalation tactics and cultural sensitivity training, determined to educate himself and understand the communities he served better. Meanwhile, Ethan was busy as well. He began speaking at community meetings, sharing his story and advocating for changes within the police department. He wanted to raise awareness about the impact of racial profiling and how it eroded trust between law enforcement and the communities they were supposed to protect. Each time he spoke, he felt a sense of empowerment, channeling his pain into a mission for justice. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Captain Carter called for another meeting. Thatcher arrived, anxious and uncertain. The room was filled with familiar faces, including Ethan, who had agreed to return and provide his perspective once again. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. "Thank you all for coming," Carter began, her voice steady. "Today, we will discuss the findings of our investigation into Officer Thatcher's conduct during the incident involving Mr. Cole. We have gathered witness statements, body cam footage, and expert opinions on police practices, and I believe it's crucial that we have an open dialogue about what happened and how we can move forward." Thatcher sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He could feel the weight of everyone's gaze, especially Ethan's, who looked both resolute and hopeful. Carter outlined the findings, detailing how Thatcher's actions were influenced by implicit bias and how they led to an unjust arrest. She emphasized the importance of accountability and the need for systemic change within the department. After she finished, she turned to Thatcher. "Officer Thatchers, do you have anything you'd like to say?" Taking a deep breath, Thatcher stood. His voice trembled slightly as he began. "I know that I messed up. I allowed my biases to cloud my judgment, and I let that affect how I treated Mr. Cole. I'm deeply sorry for my actions and the pain they caused. I realize now that it's not enough to just do my job. I have to do it with an understanding of the people I serve. I'm committed to changing, to learning, and to ensuring this doesn't happen again." There was a silence in the room, and Thatcher felt exposed, vulnerable. But he also felt a sense of relief. He had finally spoken the truth, and it was a weight lifted off his shoulders. Ethan looked up at him, and in that moment, there was a flicker of understanding between them. "Thank you for acknowledging your mistakes, Officer Thatchers," he said, his voice calm. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. I hope you follow through on your commitment to change, not just for yourself, but for everyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation." Carter nodded, appreciating Ethan's response. "This is a crucial step toward healing and rebuilding trust within our community. We will be implementing new training programs and revising our protocols to address bias in policing." The meeting continued, filled with discussions about reforms and how they could work together to create a safer environment for everyone. Thatcher listened intently, realizing that he was part of a larger conversation, one that could lead to real change. As the meeting adjourned, Thatcher felt a newfound sense of purpose. He approached Ethan, who was gathering his things. "Thank you for your words today. I know it won't erase what happened, but I hope to earn your trust back." Ethan met his gaze with a steady look. "It's a process, Officer Thatchers, but I believe we can get there together, one step at a time." With that, they shook hands, a small yet significant moment that marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Thatcher but for their community as a whole. As Thatcher walked out of the precinct, he felt a mix of anxiety and hope. He was ready to face the challenges ahead, determined to be better, to listen more, and to ensure that justice was served fairly for all. The journey wouldn't be easy, but it was a journey worth taking. In the weeks that followed, the precinct began to undergo significant changes. Training sessions focused on bias awareness and community engagement became a regular part of the officers' schedules. Thatcher found himself deeply involved, helping to facilitate discussions and share his experiences. Each session was a mix of tension and growth, as officers confronted their biases and the realities of their work. One day, after a particularly intense training session, Thatcher caught up with one of his colleagues, Officer Reed. "It's been tough to face this stuff, hasn't it?" Thatcher remarked, wiping sweat from his brow. Reed nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, it's uncomfortable, but it's good to talk about it. I never realized how my assumptions affected the way I did my job." Thatcher appreciated Reed's honesty. "It's a start. We're all learning here, and it's important that we support each other through this." As the precinct evolved, Thatcher also made a point to connect with the community. He began attending local events, listening to residents share their concerns and hopes for the future. It was eye-opening to hear their stories firsthand, to understand the complexities of the issues they face daily. Ethan was often there as well, speaking out about the importance of building trust and collaboration between the police and the community. At one community meeting, Ethan introduced a new initiative, a mentorship program aimed at fostering positive relationships between youth and officers. "We need to bridge the gap between our community and the police," he said passionately. Meyer shot him a glare, but a few other officers nodded in agreement. Thatcher knew that change wouldn't come easily. It would take time and persistence. As the months progressed, Thatcher continued to push for change. He worked alongside Ethan to refine the mentorship program, developing activities that would engage youth in positive ways. They organized sports clinics, art workshops, and community cleanup days, all aimed at fostering connections between officers and residents. The first event, a neighborhood block party, was a turning point. Thatcher watched as officers and community members mingled, laughter filling the air. Ethan led a discussion about safety and respect, encouraging open dialogue between the youth and the officers. Thatcher saw kids interacting with officers, playing games and sharing snacks, breaking down the barriers that had long separated them. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the gathering, Thatcher felt a sense of hope. He caught sight of Ethan talking with a group of teens, laughter bubbling over as they shared stories. It was a moment of connection, one that represented the progress they had all been striving for. But not everyone was pleased with the shift. Thatcher began receiving anonymous messages, threats warning him to back off from Ethan and the initiatives they were pursuing. At first, he dismissed them, but as they continued, he grew increasingly concerned. One evening, after a particularly successful community event, Thatcher returned to his car to find a note wedged under the windshield wiper. The message was clear and chilling. "You're making a mistake, Thatchers. Stay out of it." Shaken, he tore the note in half and tossed it aside. This was part of the challenge he had to face. He had chosen a difficult path, but he couldn't turn back now. He had to keep fighting for what was right, despite the backlash. He confided in Ethan, sharing his concerns. "I'm worried about the pushback. It feels like there are people who want to shut this down before it really gets started." Ethan listened carefully, his expression serious. "We can't let fear dictate our actions. Change is never easy, and it often comes with resistance. But if we stand together, we can overcome this." Determined to stay the course, Thatcher continued to work alongside Ethan in the community. They hosted more events, each one building momentum. Slowly, more officers began to see the value in the outreach efforts, realizing that building trust could lead to better policing and safer neighborhoods. Then one evening, after a long day of outreach, Thatcher received a call from Captain Carter. "Thatcher, I need you to come into the precinct right away. We have a situation." Anxiety gripped him as he rushed to the station. When he arrived, he found Carter waiting for him in her office, a serious look on her face. "We've had reports of escalating tensions in the community regarding a recent incident. We need your experience in community relations to help de-escalate the situation." "What happened?" Thatcher asked, his heart pounding. "There was an altercation between a couple of officers and residents during a routine stop. It's already making waves on social media, and we need to address it before it spirals out of control." Thatcher nodded, determination flooding through him. "I'll do whatever it takes. Let's bring the community together and start a dialogue." Together they organized a town hall meeting, inviting residents to voice their concerns and hear directly from the officers involved. Thatcher worked alongside Ethan, who encouraged residents to share their experiences. The room was filled with tension, voices raised as emotions ran high. Thatcher stood at the front, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. "I know there are feelings of anger and distrust, and I want to acknowledge that. It's crucial for us to listen to each other and understand where these feelings come from. We can't move forward without open dialogue." The meeting was intense, with many residents sharing their experiences of feeling unfairly targeted or disrespected by police. Thatcher felt the weight of their words, realizing just how much work lay ahead. After several hours of discussion, they finally reached a point of understanding. Some officers apologized for their actions, while residents shared their willingness to collaborate for change. The meeting ended on a hopeful note, with plans for more forums to keep the dialogue open. As he left the precinct that night, Thatcher felt exhausted but fulfilled. The road to rebuilding trust was long and winding, but he knew they were making progress. He looked forward to working with Ethan and the community, knowing that together they could make a difference. Months later, standing at a community gathering, Thatcher watched as children played and families connected with officers. He had come a long way from the man who had made a mistake that cost him dearly. Now he was part of a movement to create a safer, more inclusive environment. He saw Ethan across the park, engaged in conversation with a group of youth, and he felt a surge of gratitude for the journey they had undertaken together. In that moment, Thatcher knew he had made the right choice. The challenges ahead were daunting, but with every step, they were rewriting the narrative, transforming fear into understanding and division into unity. They were building a legacy of change, one conversation at a time, and it was a legacy worth fighting for. As summer rolled into fall, Thatcher's efforts to strengthen ties between the police and the community gained traction. The mentorship program began to flourish, with more youth attending events and forming friendships with the officers. Thatcher felt a renewed sense of purpose each time he watched the young people laughing and learning alongside their mentors, who were starting to see them not just as potential suspects, but as future leaders. But the challenges of maintaining the momentum were still present. Thatcher found himself regularly navigating resistance from some officers who were set in their ways. One evening during a department meeting, Officer Grayson Meyer raised his hand. I still don't see how this community outreach is worth our time. We have crime to fight. We can't babysit these kids. Thatcher inhaled deeply, preparing to address the skepticism. Meyer, think about it this way. Every moment we spend building trust could prevent a future incident. The more we engage, the less likely we are to face those intense confrontations. Meyer crossed his arms, unconvinced. But what if they don't change? What if they just take advantage of us? That's the risk we have to take. We won't know unless we try, Thatcher replied, his voice steady. While he knew some officers would remain resistant, he also saw more and more of his colleagues beginning to embrace the outreach initiatives. They witnessed firsthand how the community was responding positively, and the success stories began to spread. Young people were sharing their experiences of having meaningful interactions with police officers, and some of them even expressed interest in careers in law enforcement. One afternoon, as Thatcher was preparing for another community event, he received a phone call from Ethan. Hey Thatcher, I've got some exciting news. The local school district is interested in partnering with us for a youth safety summit. They want police involvement to help educate students on safety and crime prevention. That's fantastic, Thatcher exclaimed, excitement bubbling up inside him. This could be a great way to get the community involved and educate the next generation. They immediately began organizing the summit, reaching out to schools, local businesses, and community organizations. With each passing week, their collaboration solidified, and they successfully drew in a diverse group of participants, including students, parents, and community leaders. On the day of the summit, the community center was buzzing with energy. Thatcher watched as students engaged in various workshops, learning about conflict resolution, peer pressure, and the role of police in maintaining safety. The atmosphere was filled with laughter and curiosity, a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined their interactions. At the closing session, Thatcher stood before the gathered audience, feeling a swell of pride. Today, we've taken significant steps towards understanding and collaboration. I want each of you to remember that you have the power to shape your community. Building trust is a two-way street, and we're committed to being here for you. As the summit concluded, a young girl approached him. Officer Thatchers, thank you for today. I learned a lot about how to stay safe and how to talk to police. I want to be a police officer when I grow up. Thatcher felt a warmth in his heart. You can definitely be an amazing officer. Just remember to always be kind and keep learning. As he watched the young girl run back to her friends, he realized how far they had come. The seeds of change were taking root, and he knew the future looked brighter. However, the undercurrents of resistance remained. One evening, after a late shift, Thatcher was returning home when he noticed a figure lingering outside his house. His instincts kicked in as he slowed down, squinting through the darkness. It was a familiar face, Officer Grayson Meyer, his expression grim. Thatcher, we need to talk, Meyer said, stepping into the light. What's going on? Thatcher asked, apprehension creeping in. Meyer hesitated, then continued. I'm hearing rumors. Some of the guys think you're trying to undermine the department with all these community initiatives. They're questioning your loyalty. Thatcher felt a mixture of anger and disappointment. My loyalty is to the community and to making this precinct better. We can't keep doing things the old way if we want real change. Meyer shook his head. I know. I worry about what might happen next. There are people who don't like how things are shifting. Some believe we're giving too much away. Thatcher took a deep breath, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. We have to stand firm. I believe in this, and I know many others do too, but we can't let fear stop us from doing what's right. In the days that followed, tensions grew palpable within the precinct. Whispers and stares became commonplace. Despite this, Thatcher kept pushing forward, pouring his energy into the community programs and mentoring initiatives. One evening, he was meeting with Ethan and several young mentees when he received a call from Captain Carter. Thatcher, we need you back at the precinct right away. There's been an incident. His heart raced as he hurried to the station. When he arrived, he found a crowd of officers gathered in the briefing room, their faces tense. Carter stood at the front, her voice steady but urgent. We've received reports of a protest forming in response to a recent incident involving an officer and a community member. They're calling for accountability. Thatcher felt a knot form in his stomach. What happened? Carter gestured to a nearby screen, where footage from the incident was playing. Thatcher watched, his heart sinking as he saw an officer using excessive force during a stop. It was a stark reminder of the work that still lay ahead. "We need to act quickly," Carter said, her tone firm. "Thatcher, I want you to help facilitate a meeting with community leaders. We need to show them we're committed to accountability and transparency." Thatcher nodded, ready to rise to the challenge. "Let's bring everyone together and start a dialogue." As he and Carter began reaching out to community leaders, he could feel the tension in the air thickening. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and discussions. Finally, they organized a community forum to address the incident, inviting residents to share their thoughts and concerns. Thatcher stood at the front of the room, alongside Ethan and other community leaders, as the crowd filled the seats. "Thank you all for coming," Thatcher began, his voice steady. "We're here to listen and to ensure that your voices are heard. We recognize the pain and frustration this incident has caused, and we're committed to working together to find a path forward." As the forum progressed, emotions ran high. Community members spoke passionately, voicing their fears and frustrations. Thatcher listened intently, recognizing the urgency of their concerns. When the time came for him to respond, he stood firm. "I want to acknowledge that what happened was unacceptable. It does not reflect the values we're trying to uphold in our department," he stated, looking directly at the audience. "We are here to hold ourselves accountable, and we will work to ensure this doesn't happen again." The room erupted in murmurs, some nodding in agreement, while others remained skeptical. Ethan stepped forward, echoing Thatcher's sentiments. "We're all part of this community, and together we can make it better. Let's commit to ongoing dialogue, to hold each other accountable, and to ensure that our police force serves and protects everyone." As the meeting concluded, Thatcher felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges, but he knew they were on the right track. They were forging a new narrative together, one that would shape the future for their community and their department. Months passed, and while not every day was easy, the changes began to take root. Officers started to feel more connected to the community, and residents began to see police in a different light. Thatcher witnessed these transformations firsthand as he continued to engage with both his colleagues and the community. One sunny afternoon, he attended a neighborhood block party, surrounded by laughter and joy. As he mingled with families, he spotted a group of children playing with some of the officers from the precinct. They were laughing, sharing stories, and building bonds that would last a lifetime. Thatcher felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. This was what he had fought for, the chance to create a better future for both the community and the police force. As he watched Ethan laughing with a group of teens, he felt a sense of accomplishment. They had faced resistance and adversity, but together they had built something meaningful. Just then, a young boy approached him, holding a colorful drawing. "Look, Officer Thatchers, I made this for you." Thatcher knelt down, his heart swelling with pride as he admired the artwork. "It's amazing." "Thank you so much. You're a fantastic artist." The boy beamed, his eyes shining with happiness. In that moment, Thatcher realized the power of connection, of breaking down barriers and creating understanding. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the festivities, Thatcher took a deep breath and smiled. They had come so far, and while there was still work to be done, he felt hopeful. The path ahead would be filled with challenges, but with unity and determination, they could continue to change the narrative for generations to come. Thatcher understood that their journey was ongoing, and he was ready to face whatever came next. Together they would rewrite the story of their community, one filled with trust, respect, and hope. Thatcher stood at the edge of the gathering, watching as children laughed, families shared meals, and officers mingled with the community. It was a scene he had never imagined witnessing, let alone being a part of. His heart felt lighter, though the weight of the journey they still had to take lingered in the back of his mind. As he scanned the crowd, his eyes met Ethan's. The FBI agent was speaking with a group of young adults, his hands gesturing animatedly as they hung on to his every word. Ethan's ability to inspire was undeniable, and Thatcher couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration and perhaps gratitude. Walking toward Ethan, Thatcher felt a nervous energy build within him. When Ethan noticed him approaching, his expression softened, but his demeanor remained poised. "Ethan," Thatcher began, his voice steady but deliberate. "I just wanted to say thank you, not just for your patience with me, but for everything you've done for this community and for me." Ethan nodded, his eyes searching Thatcher's face for sincerity. "It's not just about me, Thatcher. It's about what we do from here on out. Change is a team effort." Thatcher extended his hand. "I'm committed to being part of that team for real this time." Ethan shook his hand, his grip firm. "Good, because this work doesn't end here." As the evening deepened, the crowd began to disperse. Thatcher lingered, his thoughts turning inward. This wasn't a finish line. It was a checkpoint on a long road. There were still minds to change, systems to challenge, and trust to rebuild. Driving home that night, Thatcher rolled down his car window, letting the crisp evening air fill the space. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel defined by his past mistakes. Instead, he felt determined to keep moving forward, to keep learning, and to ensure that the bridges they were building now would stand strong for generations to come. The road ahead would be anything but smooth, but Thatcher was ready to walk it, not as the man he had been, but as the man he was striving to become. And this time, he wouldn't walk it alone.